Well, welcome everyone. It is our Tuesday webinar, Protecting American Elms from Dutch Elm Disease, almost 50 years later and still going. Welcome all, welcome all. We've got a little bit of a short presentation, and I have recorded the bulk of this, but we'll go through the technical information, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A, and I'll be on here, so if there's questions that are in the Q&A section, please do send those in and we'll get those answered. Couple of housekeeping of items. If you have questions, please do type it into the Q&A box using your control panel. I will try to answer those, if they're appropriate, kind of on the section that we're on. Otherwise, we'll end with questions. And there is a webinar link that's being recorded, and it will be sent out about 2 days after this is completed. This is worth one ISA CEU, pardon me. So please do enter your ISA number in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll make sure to record that. I know that it's a part of the registration, but maybe there's someone else of your team that's with you. But please do enter that, and we want to make sure everybody gets credit for their ISA CEUs. And then certainly if there is a technical glitch, maybe the screen freezes or the Wi-Fi crashes or something of the unforeseen, please do be patient. We'll get it up, back and running. And I look forward to sharing this great information with you and then answering your questions at the end. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Peter's going to play the recording. And as Peter's getting that queued up and ready, look forward to answering all the questions, and we'll kick it off now. Thank you. Welcome all. I want to introduce myself. My name is Chris Haugen from Rainbow Ecoscience. I'm the Assistant Director of Sales, and today I'm going to talk to you about Dutch Elm Disease and the protocol around it for protecting elms from this disease. This is certainly a topic that I love. My career kind of started with elms, and it's a bit of coming home for me. When I started in tree care, my job was as a groundie, and I always would see these beautiful, majestic elms, and it certainly always made me very sad whenever we had to remove one of those. And I worked for a small tree company in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I did this through my undergraduate work. And then after graduating, I came to Rainbow Tree Care, which is our sister company to Rainbow Ecoscience. And my first job at Rainbow was as a inject care technician doing Dutch Elm Disease. So exactly this protocol that I'm going to be talking to you about. I spent many summers doing this, training on it, doing research on it, and which brings me to even now. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was in the Seattle area doing exactly this protocol training with other new technicians. So it's something that's very still present for me, and I'm very excited to bring this protocol to you. And for some of you, this might be a refresher. Some of you might be hearing this for the first time, but certainly I'm excited to bring this information to you. And then certainly, please do reach out to me with questions afterwards. And then after the recording is done, we'll also have time for questions, or if there's anything you'd like me to clarify. And then we'll go through the three things here that I want to talk about. And with Dutch Elm Disease, and I want you to keep in mind these three things. And I say this in a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but also it's always helped me with kind of mnemonic devices of how to remember this protocol when I'm training or when I'm doing this. The first one being Americans love bacon. And this is going to be especially important when we talk about how does this pathogen work? How does it work within the plant? How do we manage it? Second, when we get into the application details, little details adding up to saving you time. It's a lot of little things that ultimately, when you do them right, you will have these applications done in an hour to 2 hours. And then finally, this is the only predictable protocol for managing Dutch elm disease in mature American elms. But again, I want to bring the resources that are available to you. Rainbow Ecoscience is committed to this protocol. It's what we ultimately started our business on at Rainbow Tree Care and also with Rainbow Ecoscience. And in that, we have that unique ability to provide you technical support and field training. With that technical support, whether it's PHC diagnostics, the product, or equipment, and also ordering, we are there to support you. And I want you to, I'd encourage you to save this phone number and the text number and the email as, save it into your cell phones as a contact as Rainbow Ecoscience Tech Support. We're here to provide you that exact information. Whether it's maybe you're a technician in the field and you're not quite sure where to put your infusion sites, or is this Dutch elm disease? Maybe it's flagging, maybe it's just a broken limb, but you want to have a second opinion, we're there to help you out. You can text us, give us a phone call, or reach out to us however way makes sense to you, whether it's our tech support line, your territory manager, or an arborologist. We're there to provide you the information as quickly as possible to get you on with your day. Finally, we also have our application and treatment guides, whether you're treating for Dutch elm disease, or some of you might be on this because you want to learn more about the macro process for beech leaf disease. And also encourage you to check out our webinars in a couple weeks on that as well. But then we also have our Arbitech product guide. And then finally, we have our application videos. These are short little nuggets of great information, whether it's on drilling, mixing, where to put your teas, or the setting up of your pump and tube and harness. All of them are there so that you can look at them on your cell phone and get the information that you need quickly. So let's jump into the protocol itself. The steps of macro-infusion are pretty simple. We want to first inspect the tree, and that's where, when I talk about Americans love bacon, that's where that's going to come in. Then we're going to excavate the root flare, drill our holes, insert the teas, begin our infusion with water, then add our Arbitect, then monitor, and then clean up. It's 8 simple steps, but there are lots of little details within there that I'm going to cover with you so that you can ensure that you're doing this properly. The first, inspect the tree. And this is where I bring up the Americans love bacon. The first thing to always make sure we know is this an elm tree? And is this an American elm? Dutch elm disease is primarily a disease of American elms. Yes, there are certainly occasions where red, slippery Chinese, or maybe some of the new hybrid elms, they can come down with Dutch elm disease. But 90+% of the applications that we do are for American elms. And this was an easy mnemonic device that I was taught when I was a technician the first time of how do I identify an American elm? Because certainly looking at the leaves, while it can be very distinctive, sometimes, due to tree stress, they can not always be clear. And my vision's not always that great. So I don't necessarily trust my eyes always up in the canopy. I'm going to look at what can I see at the bark tissue. So if we were to take a 2-inch section of that outer bark, peel that off, just that outer core cambium, which is kind of corky, you'll see it should look a little bit like raw bacon. There'll be kind of white striations. There'll be sections that look almost like bacon fat. And for whatever reason, that has always stuck with me. It looks like bacon. Americans love bacon. It's an American elm. The reason we want to double check this, not only to make sure that we're actually treating an elm, is to make sure that we're treating it with the right rate. If you're treating a red or a slippery or perhaps another variation, which is certainly less common, you are going to use a different rate than with American elms. And then second, we want to make sure we're inspecting that canopy because this protocol only works as a preventative. It does not work therapeutically. Now we'll get into some nuances to that of what we can do prior to application if we do suspect that there is Dutch elm disease in this tree. But the main thing is we want to ensure that our technicians are looking at the canopy thoroughly to ensure that it doesn't have Dutch elm disease. And then we're also going to want to look at that root flare. Perhaps there's some decay pockets. A lot of these elms have been around for a very long time. Perhaps they've outgrown their tree pits, or kind of if they're in a boulevard, maybe they're in between the sidewalk and the road. Perhaps there isn't a whole lot of root flare for us to really work with. But we want to at least inspect that to make sure that we're drilling and infusing into a really healthy root tissue. But let's talk a little bit about what actually causes Dutch elm disease and what is Dutch elm disease. Dutch elm disease is a fungus, and the Latin name is Ophiostoma novo-ulmi, and it grows in the current year's water-conducting tissue, or xylem. Now, this is kind of an interesting story. Dutch elm disease, it didn't originate in the United States or in North America. It came over from Europe. And this is an interesting story that crosses the Atlantic twice. It originally came to the United States in about the 1930s into Cleveland. But then we transported it back to Europe, and it was originally called Ophiostoma ulmi, basically disease of elms. We transported it back to Europe, and then it came back in the 70s. So everybody talks about, the late 70s, early 80s, which was really the heyday of Dutch elm disease. It's this new pathogen, the novo part. That's what really made the elms decline quickly. It was a more virulent strain, and elms weren't as able to tolerate it. And that's why the population of Dutch elm disease really ramped up in the 70s. Now, from a management perspective, it really doesn't matter whether you're dealing with the original or the new. 90% or 99+% of the strains that we see are the new strain. It all ends up being the same, and we treat it the same. But what's important is that this is a disease of the xylem tissue. And you can see in this photo, this is actually a picture of the fungus developing inside of that xylem tissue. And if you were to take a sample of that woody tissue to a lab, maybe your diagnostic lab in your state, this is what they're going to try to plate out and grow to positively identify it. And when I talk about the xylem tissue, we're talking about the sapwood. So it's what's transporting mostly our water from the root system up to the canopy of the tree. That's where this pathogen really lies. It's not in the heartwood and it's not in the phloem. It's in that xylem tissue. So if you were to peel off the bark of those 2 to 4-year-old tissues, you're going to be able to see after the pathogen is developed, you're going to be able to see it in that xylem tissue. And this is also where we want to be drilling into in the root system. More on that later. Let's talk a little bit about how this is actually transmitted. Dutch elm disease is primarily transmitted via insect vector, either the North American elm bark beetle or the European elm bark beetle. They both are, generally speaking, equally present. They do have 2 slightly different life cycles where they're kind of timed in the spring and early summer, which extends that infection period. But what's important to note is that, generally speaking, about 90% of the spread of new Dutch elm disease infections occurs via bark beetle infection. Unlike, say, if you have been to maybe our oak wilt seminars, where 90% of the infections start from a new root graft. It's the exact opposite with elms. It's primarily driven by the bark beetles, which is partially why we also recommend that you don't prune elms during the summer, because it can encourage infection rates with those bark beetles. With the root grafts, and I'll stick with this just briefly here, trees that are in close proximity or their crowns are generally touching may have grafted roots. And it's important to note that this is going to be American elms to American elms, reds to red. Now, certainly root grafts can go under hardscapes, for example, maybe a sidewalk or maybe a new driveway or something that had been recently put in. But usually speaking, if it's underneath a road or a major street, where there's sewer, electrical, and those types of things, generally speaking, we don't see too many root grafts underneath roads. So if you're looking at root graft disruption, which is going to be important, and we're going to discuss this briefly about how the pathogen moves within a treatment area, it's just important to note that root graft disruption is an important part of this protocol. It's not going to be a focus of what we talk about today, but certainly if you have canopies that are touching and you're coming into an area that maybe hasn't been treated before and you see a little bit of Dutch elm disease, this should certainly be something you reach out to us and get some guidance about how to do this and where to put your graft, your root zone cuttings in. But let's talk a bit about elm bark beetles because it drives what we are really talking about for infections. They're going to feed in the crotches of those 2 to 4-year-old branches. And a rough kind of size is, think of your pinky. That's about the size of a 2 to 4-year-old branch crotch. And notice also that those are going to be primarily at the exterior of the canopy. They're not going to, generally speaking, be in the interior. We look for primarily at the exterior or the farthest margins of the canopy. That's where they're going to love to feed, and also generally at the very top of the tree. That's where we're going to often see these infections start. A common question that I hear often is, well, should I include a contact insecticide spray for these bark beetles as a part of my management plan? And I respond with, it's certainly an option. However, I make the distinction, it does not guarantee, nor does it dramatically improve the predictability of ensuring the tree doesn't get Dutch elm disease. Because even if we have very good coverage, if we don't cover all of those 2 to 4-year-old branches and we have just one bark beetle that's able to feed in one of those branch collars, we could potentially have introduced Dutch elm disease. And the tree doesn't have a defense mechanism to stop that, even if it's just one. So certainly, yes, it will reduce the population of potential vectors, but it's not a predictable way to actually reduce the infection of Dutch elm disease, or that we could rely on it for our specific client's tree. And in this photo on the right, you can see where this is actually feeding. So it's very small, and they're feeding right in between those branch unions. So very small, especially as you look at kind of in the context of the size of those leaves. And then when you compare it to the actual size of an elm bark beetle, these are very tiny. I've never seen one in the landscape. I've seen them certainly in diagnostic labs and vials, but I've personally never actually seen one out in the landscape. So you're not likely to see them, but they're actually feeding, and that's where they're actually introducing this pathogen. Now, once we actually talk about how this disease progresses in the plant, an important term that you're going to hear from myself and most people that are out scouting for this is, do you see flagging? Now, flagging doesn't really help necessarily biologically from a diagnostic perspective, but it is a common term in usage. And what we mean by flagging is you'll see the leaves as they become brown, they're going to start to droop. And this is a great indicator. You can see the progression of the disease through that branch tissue. And what's unique about Dutch elm disease versus other diseases and even many insect issues is the leaves will remain on the tree. With other diseases or even abiotic issues, oftentimes those leaves, as they become, diseased or stressed, they'll actually drop off. So oak wilt, for example, oftentimes a great indicator is if you're seeing leaves on the grass on the ground below the tree. With Dutch elm disease, it will retain those leaves. Certainly in high winds, you might have some that blow off, but as you can see in this photo, primarily all of the leaves are still on that tree. And we can see those 2 to 4 year old branch unions. That's where it started. And those leaves, and we call it kind of the drooping effect. The leaves are flat, and then as they slowly die, they're going to start to kind of fold in and curl down, but then they start to droop. And then as that pathogen progresses, and this is what's important, as that pathogen is progressing, the tree is actually trying to wall off and compartmentalize it, but it just can't get ahead of fast enough this disease. So it's actually the tree's own response that's in a way choking off the water in the tree's own livelihood. And that's where it's progressing. You can see the leaves are starting to yellow, they're starting to curl and then droop as it progresses down that branch. And that's what we call flagging. And this is a crucial part of, Americans love bacon, inspecting that tree. We want to make sure we look at the entire canopy, look at the neighboring canopy, look at the neighbor's tree, see what we can see to make sure that we're not injecting into a tree that already has Dutch elm disease. And in this progression of 3 photos here, you can see the progression on the left where that disease started at the very top and then it progressed as that fungus is growing inside the xylem tissue. You can see it progressing down that primary lead. An easy indicator, if you send a climber up there or you're able to grab a sample with a large pole saw, is you should see streaking. And this is what's on the right side, and you can see it in the center photo as well. And what's important to note is that is not the actual fungus itself. It's the plant's response to it as it walls that off and that xylem tissue dies. So if you're taking a sample, you want to make sure that you're bringing in a sample that is just below that streaking. That's where the actual living fungus actually is. And I mentioned we can also prune this disease out. So in this circumstance on the tree on the left, I like this photo because it's a great example. If we were to remove above, kind of in the middle of that photo, you can see kind of where there's that V-shaped branch union that's a little bit yellow, where there's flagging on both sides. If we were to remove that branch union, go about 2 to 5 feet below that, it's possible we could physically remove the infected tissue and then treat that tree. But what's critically important is we have to make sure that we're getting to it before it gets to the root system. Because once that pathogen gets to the root flare and goes back up to the tree unfortunately is not going to survive. And that's the key part, is that we're trying to get ahead of it with our pruning. Now, with the Dutch elm disease, the macro process, what we're doing is we're creating a prophylactic. Think of it as painting the inside of that xylem tissue with fungicide such that we can ensure that no matter where those bark beetles are feeding, it can't get a foothold with that disease. So now we're going to talk a little bit about where we're going to go from here with our application process. The first thing we want to do after we've inspected that root flare is excavate and clean the root flares. Unlike with microinjection, where maybe you're injecting maybe within 12 inches of that soil line, we're actually going to excavate down 8 to 10 inches below the soil line to expose those root flares. And we do that for three primary reasons. The first being in the root tissue, we have far superior lateral movement of the chemistry. We're using a far higher volume of fluid and material that we want to paint that interior xylem tissue with. The second being we're going to get faster wound closure or compartmentalization than in the trunk tissue. And then the third one, which is really important in some of these pitfalls that we ask people when they're maybe calling us in for tech support, is it gives us far greater surface area for tea placement. If we're looking at how many infusion sites we're going to be doing, it's the rule of thumb is diameter times 1.5. So for example, a 30-inch elm tree, we're going to have 45 infusion teas at a minimum. On this particular elm, which has such a beautiful root flare as we excavate down, we might even have diameter times 2. So on a 30-inch, we might have 60. The key point is we want to use what the root flare is giving us and give ourselves as much surface area to infuse product into. When we're excavating, we want to make sure we're not damaging the root flare. I prefer to use a rounded shovel versus like a flat spade. There's less issue of you kind of gouging into the root tissue. But I also want to make it clear that you want to excavate out 8 to 10 inches deep, so down to excavate, and then also make sure you're giving yourself plenty of room width-wise of that moat. And an easy way to make sure that kind of you have enough room is if you can put your boot inside of it, as if you were facing the tree, that should be about how wide your moat and trench should be to give yourself ample room to work and place your tubing and tees. Once we've excavated, we want to make sure we clear off those root flares. This may seem kind of like an arbitrary step, but it's for two very important reasons. The first is to ensure that we're removing all of that excess mineral soil, which can get caught in our drill bit. Drill bits and mineral soil don't mix very well, so we can make sure our drill bits are staying sharp. The second being, it's easier for us to see what that tissue looks like. We can ensure that we're not drilling in any dead or decaying tissue. Maybe it was hit by a lawnmower, or maybe it's kind of an inner part of the canopy. I mean, we just don't know what's going on there. This helps us see exactly what we're working with. And what I want to point out also in this photo is you can see that 8 to 10 inches of that color change where the bark tissue or trunk tissue is kind of that whitish, greenish gray. Once we get into the root tissue, you can see that beautiful, smooth, it's darker red. That's far more vascular tissue per square inch than what's even 2 or 3 inches above it. It's far more conductive. So this is what we want to be looking for and digging into. Now, certainly you might look at some sites where there just isn't any way we can actually excavate. That is certainly possible. Certainly you may not be able to remove sidewalks or concrete walls. In those circumstances, I'd encourage you to reach out to our tech support to get an idea of maybe where you could infuse into, because those are certainly the exception to this, but always try to excavate as much as you possibly can to expose this root flare. Now we're going to start drilling, and it may seem, again, like a small detail, like, well, what's the difference between drill bits? We recommend using a sharp, very sharp, razor sharp 15/64 high helix drill bit. Now, these are not necessarily commonly found at a local hardwood store. They don't necessarily keep high helix drill bits on hand, and certainly they may not keep 15/64. The reason we recommend a high helix drill bit is that it has a cutting surface on both sides of the length of that drill bit. So as you're drilling in and as you're pulling that drill bit out, it's actually going to be cutting equally. And they're also razor sharp. And we mean razor sharp as a surgical instrument. These may be after five trees. Certainly you could use them for other things, maybe around your shop. But think of this as we are a tree surgeon, and we want to have a razor sharp infusion site. And to make that point, think of a plastic straw. If you were to cut a plastic straw in half with a razor knife or brand new scissors, the circle of that straw will remain a circle. Whereas if you use a dull butter knife and try to pull and tear that apart, it's going to make that, instead of a circle, it's going to make it perhaps an oval or some sort of or other deformed shape. That's exactly the same thing that those xylem cells are doing. We want to have razor sharp cuts so that we're still able to have those vessels open, so that when that fluid of fungicide and water is in contact with that, it has adequate uptake. That's a very common issue of when we're talking to a technician that's having slow uptake is we ask them, when did you change your drill bit? And they might say, I don't know, I found it at the bottom of my bucket and it's all rusty. And it's, well, your drill bit's dull. And an easy way to tell if your drill bit is dull is when you're drilling, you should be getting long, bright white pigtails out of it. If you're getting kind of small bits of your wood chips that are coming out of it, your drill bit's probably just too dull. And that's a good point of when we're drilling, we want to make sure we're drilling into healthy, vigorous root tissue. And when we're drilling, we want to drill perpendicular to the root flare's surface. That means, we have to sometimes drill, with the angle of the root tissue is, maybe you're drilling at a 45-degree angle to the soil line. That's okay. Make sure that you're drilling 90 degrees, making a 90-degree angle from that drill bit to the actual tissue. We aren't trying to create an angle where we're trying to use gravity or other kind of angles to maybe use other methods to improve uptake. As you'll see in those tees, we want to create a nice 90-degree interface with that. And as far as drill depth, we want to go about 1 inch past the bark into the xylem tissue. A common question is, can I put like a drill depth gauge on there? I don't necessarily recommend using a depth gauge because the depth of that bark tissue can vary slightly. It's a bit of using feel, but we want to make sure we're getting about 1 inch past into that xylem tissue. And then as you're drilling, we don't want to spin the bit in the hole, because if we're spinning the drill bit, that's going to cause an enormous amount of heat, which can cauterize that tissue, and it's going to slow our uptake down. And then also when you're drilling, it should be one consistent movement in and out. We don't need to go back and forth in that hole, which is going to, again, cause cauterization. Next, where do we put our infusion sites? So you can see there's a couple of green dots here. We want to make sure that we're putting them on the primary roots. And a good distance, kind of a barometer of that, is your pinky to your pointer finger, about 3.5 to 4 inches apart. And we want to make sure that we're avoiding these deep valleys or areas where perhaps there's more decay pockets, because we can't necessarily see what that vascular tissue looks like, because in a decay pocket, you could be infusing into a cavity, or it's just non-conductive and you're just going to be wasting time and energy on that. Now, certainly, as I mentioned before, the number of infusion sites, the minimum is diameter times 1.5. Use what the root flare is going to give you. As I mentioned on this one, it's a beautiful root flare. I probably was closer to 2 times diameter for the number of infusion sites. It's only going to improve the lateral distribution and also reduce the amount of time our uptake of fungicide takes. Unlike with macro-infusion, where you're going to be going above the soil line, where it's diameter divided by 2. And I'll show you here as an example of, it was a technician that hadn't been properly trained on the protocol. They were used to doing micro-injection. As you can see here, they were going above the soil line. Perhaps they didn't want to remove the flowers of the bedding plants, but they also maybe thought, well, excavating takes extra time. If I just put the tees in, it'll be just as fast. We've actually done in research, if you don't excavate and you go above the soil line, you have fewer infusion sites, and it actually extends how long it takes for the application to take. And a potential downside is you have reduced predictability in the protocol because there's less lateral distribution of the fungicide. So it's critically important that we're excavating the root flare and cleaning it off and drilling into root tissue. When we're putting our tees in, after we've drilled, and I prefer to drill as I kind of go, maybe like drill 2 or 3 sites and then put my tees in as I go so I don't lose sight of them. Make sure to check all the tees, because certainly if there's any mineral soil, you want to make sure they're not clogged or plugged. Use like a paper clip to kind of push those out if there's anything, or just give them a quick little flick with your finger. And insert all of the tees, but you don't need to push them in too deep. And when I say push them in, they'll kind of hand tighten. You don't need to pound them in with a hammer really hard. Just a light mallet tap just to keep them inside the hole. And one thing that'll really help with ensuring that they stay in is how you arrange the tubing and tees. We want to create a serpentine pattern with our tubing and tees. And this isn't just because we're particular of how it looks. It actually will improve, one, how you have pressure in the system. So as you turn the pump on and you have the PSI up, it'll keep that PSI consistent through all the tubing. but it'll also make sure that you don't have teas popping off of the tubing. It's much easier to put this in vertically, so have the teas arranged vertically and have this nice serpentine pattern. And you can see here as we drilled in, we're in this very nice, healthy root flare tissue that's smooth. Whereas if we were to try to go into that trunk tissue, even just above it, maybe 8 to 12 inches, there's a lot more of that outer cambium to try to get through that corky tissue. It's harder to keep your teas inside of this. And you can see that nice color change of that reddish tissue that's down in the root flare. That's fantastic. This is a perfect setup where we've got this nice serpentine pattern. The teas are spaced about 4 inches apart. This is going to give us really nice uptake for our application. A properly inserted tea, and this is important of kind of where we're looking to have these in. We don't want to have kind of to the top of that T, that T intersection. It doesn't need to be flush. We just want to have it so that that T is showing about maybe a little kind of smidgen of that widest part of the aperture. Because on the bottom of those T's, there's actually an opening at the very bottom. There's two holes on one side and then an opening on the other side. And you can kind of see the opposite ends of them in the two photos, because we're trying to get it into that most active in the current xylem versus the sapwood. That's what's actually conductive. So if we're pushing our T's in too far, we're actually not into the xylem tissue. We're into the sapwood, which it isn't conductive. So that's going to actually slow down our application. So there's no need to pound these in with a hammer or flush. Just give them a light tap with a mallet. And this is a great example of what kind of I meant by the depth. We don't need to have it pounded in flush to that tissue. It's just hand inserted with a light tap on a mallet, and it'll stay in there just fine, because the 15/64 drill bit is quite a bit smaller than the very top of that T. With our setup, now we've got it where we've got all of our T's into the root flare. Now we want to attach it to our pump. And what's really important is, and this is where sometimes maybe it's not in the training or it's kind of gets lost in the kind of the coaching year to year, we want to make sure that there's 2 points of entry into that harness. So you can see there's 2 large black spacer T's on each side of the tree. We want to make sure that we attach the harness on opposite sides. This gives us even distribution of the product, and it flows in a circle around the entire harness so that you get even pressure throughout the entire system. And it's important that we have even pressure in the system, because if we have a high pressure area, for maybe in this circumstance, we didn't have 2 points of entry into the system, it was just one. On the opposite side of where that pressure or that tubing is coming in, you'll actually have high pressure, and you're going to likely have a T or a tubing that pops out and you lose product, and it's less efficient. So just make sure you have those 2 harnesses attached at opposite ends of the system. And this is important. We've only had water in the system at this point when we turn the pump on. And I like to start with water because, one, we're not losing any chemistry, but it also allows us to bleed out the system of any air bubbles. And what we do there is pull 1 T from the back, and you'll flush out the system. It'll maybe take 10-15 seconds to once the pump is on, and it's going to bleed out any of those air bubbles. And then you tap that T that you pulled out, tap it back in, keep the system running. This is kind of, and it's an incredible experience of seeing maybe a gallon or so as you're flushing the system go into the tree, because the tree really, it's amazing how much elms pull water through the root system and through those xylem cells. And this is an example of maybe what I would hope that we can adjust. If we look at this root flare, we don't have the tubing and T's in that nice serpentine pattern. And this also is what can cause air bubbles. You can see in this system that there's a handful of air bubbles on the left side. And with lots and lots of large air bubbles, it actually reduces the efficiency of the product being able to move throughout the system. And this is going to, again, slow down your application and the uptake. So coming back to, this is a process with a few little steps that add up to make a big difference. And these are all things that if you were working with us in the field, or you called into our tech support, we would be asking you these exact questions of, when was the last time you changed your drill bit? How many infusion sites do you have? Were they clogged? And do you have any air bubbles? And then from the pumps, certainly no higher than 18 PSI, but I try to run mine at about 12 to 15, 15 being the optimal. And once we've got our system all set up, we want to mix the Arbitect in. And Arbitect is it's a fungistatic, so it's reducing or not allowing the fungal pathogen to develop in the plant. And it's a light amber color. And I just want to measure or mention, certainly, if you have water where you're mixing from that has high pH or hard water, Arbortech doesn't necessarily play nicely with that. So the easiest way to fix this is run your water through a deionizer, or use a little bit of muriatic acid to buffer that pH down. And what you should see is a nice, clear, very light amber mixture. If you have high pH, what you'll see is it'll separate out and you'll see almost like curdling milk at the top of your mix. And it's something that can be readily cleared up. It's not certainly fatal within this, but if you're calling in and you're looking at your pump and the mixture and it's got that kind of cloudy, milky precipitate on top, that will also slow down your applications because it's too high of a pH and it's not going to uptake efficiently. But it's very easy to address and fix. As we look at the pitfalls to macro-infusion, and after you've mixed it in and you've had all of your product and it's flowing in, you're really just monitoring. But the pitfalls, and kind of this is the point where people are looking at maybe, hey, this is going slower, or I'm not quite sure what's going on here. And you call into our tech support, or you're asking yourself, what could be potentially going wrong? These are the pitfalls that we have commonly run into, and these are the exact questions we'll ask you. Again, your drill bit's not razor sharp, so make sure you change every 5 trees. The drill's spun in the hole. It's cauterizing those xylem tissues. And that's where slow down the drill bit and go in once and with a consistent motion, in and then back out, versus going back in and out, in and out, in and out. Tees are not placed onto the root flares. So did you excavate? Have you excavated out enough of the root flare? Those are, again, things we're going to be looking for. Do you have the tees spaced correctly, which is going to also inform, do you have enough tees? And are they pounded in too far? Certainly I can understand maybe you're seeing a tee that, just due to the angle that it's at, or it's kind of on a weird piece of root flare, you try to pound it in, just get it in there, hit it with a hammer a few times to get it flush so it doesn't go there. The unfortunate part is what you've inadvertently done is pushed it in too far, so it's past that xylem tissue that's actually conductive, and it's into the sapwood, which there's no conductivity to that tissue, so it's really not doing anything. Do you have clogged tees? And that's a relatively easy one of looking at, kind of before you put in, are they clean? Have you washed them off with a little bit of water? And then also I make a point of, it's a good point of checking the filter on the pump. You know, certainly in a barrel, if you have a bunch of sediment or grass clippings that falls in there, that could also be clogging your pump and making it harder for the pump to work and to push efficiently. Do you have unequal pressure inside the harness? And the easiest way to kind of know that is, do you have that serpentine pattern? And then also, is your pump, if you're looking at the PSI gauge, is it jumping around? Does it go from 10 to 15 to 18 to back down to 15, down to 12? That can be a great indicator that you have unequal pressure inside the harness. And as you're monitoring and kind of making sure that you don't have any of those pitfalls going for you, you just want to check for leaks. Try to keep that pressure maintained at 12 to 15 psi, and you can start putting away maybe your other equipment, your drill, extra tubing and tees. Start doing your paperwork, or if you have another tree on the site that you're working on, you could start and it's within visual sight, you could start maybe excavating that one. But certainly you'd want to make sure before you drill that tree, make sure that you know for certain that the current application that you're doing is going to finish. And, you know, an average size tree, let's say maybe 30 to 45 inches, from the time you start the pump to when it's done, it should take about 45 to 60 minutes for all that product to uptake. And certainly if there are certainly circumstances where maybe if the canopy is a little thin due to construction damage, it can certainly take longer, or it's early in the season, or the tree is highly stressed, it can certainly take a little bit longer than this. But if you're seeing applications that are through 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours, for example, please don't hesitate to call us and have us come by and do a training with you, because we want to make sure that this protocol is efficient and predictable for you, not just from a disease standpoint, but also operationally. It's critically important to us. Finally, after the application is done, you want to clean up the site. So remove all the tees, replace any soil or sod, and then all of the equipment, I like to put my tubing and tees back in the barrel into that reservoir so I don't leave any behind. And then a critically important thing I try to tell every homeowner is water your tree. Now, certainly this doesn't require additional watering to be successful, but certainly additional watering, and certainly there are areas where maybe they've had more water this year, so you're not in a drought circumstance. But more often than not, we do want to encourage additional watering. And this is just good, basic abiotic tree health practices. But we encourage them to put perhaps a soaker hose out or put a hose out on a trickle a couple times a week at a slow trickle. That's going to help with the tree's general health. And this treatment does work better when you have a healthier elm. So it's a great practice to encourage and also encourage it before the application as well. But this is really the process in a nutshell, and these are the things that we want to encourage people to not step over. So if you have any questions or your uptakes are longer, please don't hesitate to reach out to us because we want to help you. And again, we have several things that can help you through this. We have a quick little guide that's the 7 tips for quick macro-infusion uptake. And it very much follows these 7 pitfalls, and it goes into a little more depth in them. And then on the back side, it has a rate card for doing Dutch Elm Disease and Sycamore anthracnose and beech leaf disease as well. But these are the quick things that we have seen in our experience of almost 40 years of where applications maybe take longer or they can go wrong. But again, as we're looking at, Americans love bacon. It's a part of that reviewing and inspecting the tree. It's a lot of small steps, exactly in these 7 pitfalls that add up to making a big difference. And I can say certainly if you were, let's say you hadn't changed your drill bit, you spun in the hole because it was dull, and you didn't have enough tees, your application could go from perhaps 60 minutes to maybe 2 to 3 hours. So it's again these small steps that maybe take only a couple minutes when you're doing them that can make a big difference in your application, not only in the time, but also the predictability of the protocol itself. I'll open it up now for questions. Thank you all. Please enter any questions that you might have. We'll stick around here for about 10-15 minutes, but any questions that you might have, we're happy to answer. You can throw those in the chat or in the Q&A box. And we'll make sure to get all of your ISA information in there. We got a question here on the ideal time of day to start your applications or start the pump. That's a great question, Josh. My recommendation is the first of day jobs for doing Dutch Elm Disease. I try to get out there as early as I can, whether it's 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. Try to do this the first of the day. You're going to have the most respiration or the most movement of your water through the vessels early in the morning. Now, certainly if you're doing this day in, day out, you're going to have applications that you might start at noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. But you will see as it progresses later into the day, especially in the hotter, drier parts of the summer, you might see it slow down a little bit. So I try to tell people to start, early in the morning, especially if you're doing 1 tree, make this, or maybe a 2-tree job site. If you're trying to do it first of day. That's the ideal time. And certainly, yeah, like 10 o'clock, certainly it's a great one. When you're looking at temperature of there, is it too hot? There isn't a concern from a chemistry interaction or a phytotoxicity. But certainly if you're getting up into temperatures, above 95 degrees, it will slow down. And you might have applications where it's going to slow down. However, the biggest driver, quite honestly, is not actually its air temperature. It's going to be soil moisture, which I mentioned, encouraging homeowners to water beforehand. That can be your biggest support tool, not only just for tree health, but also just to make things go as quickly as possible. Having it moving throughout the plant or getting the water going initially is going to be the best support. I will say though, if kind of it's let's say it's 1 o'clock or 12 o'clock and it's 95 degrees, soil moisture is low and it's heavily compacted soils, that might be a tree that I would maybe wait till the next morning when it's cooler. Because trees are going to start slowing down as well when it gets that hot. They're not going to want to lose as much moisture. So that's a general rule of thumb. Are there any curative Dutch elm disease chemistries being developed? The challenge with this protocol is really American elms are kind of for better or for worse, there aren't too many of them. So it's hard to do research, especially research where you're challenging this, because most places don't want you to actually inject or attack them with Dutch elm disease. So there really isn't a whole lot of research going on to try to find a new product. But certainly we are always looking at new materials and even methods to do this to protect elms. From a therapeutic, there is probably the mechanical where you're catching it early. That is probably your best tool, is to get in front of it, to identify any infected trees early, remove that infected tissue, as I talked about a little bit before with tracing. That's been a very predictable method. The usage of propiconazole as a therapeutic, what it's really doing is it's trying to stop the further dispersal in the plant of it, but it's not truly a therapeutic that it can remove the fungal pathogen from the plant, if that makes sense. Another question, applications of insecticide properly timed are worthwhile in connection with macro-infusion. Absolutely. It certainly can be a great time if you're doing like European elm scale or maybe like a elm leaf miner. What I would say is do your macro-infusion first, and then if you're going to do a soil drench with Zytect or Transtect, or you're going to do a soil injection of Lepitect, do the macro infusion first, then afterwards do your insecticide application. For some pests, you can also mix in at the very end. It's very common with oak wilt or baroque blight to mix in mectonite as a tank mix at the very end, just to control any like two-line chestnut borer. So it absolutely can be done at the same time. Do I find that uptake is better in the spring versus fall? This is another great question. When should you start in the spring or early summer? I prefer to start at full leaf development because there's also the highest pressure from the disease. As you slowly get into, let's say, late August, early September, application time will begin to creep up. And once you start to see fall color, it starts to turn yellow. It's going to be much slower. And at that point, I would suggest it's a balancing of, do you want to just wait till the following spring? Now, certainly there is a bit of a balancing act in that of, if you're not sure if the homeowner or the property manager is going to take that proposal and go with it first thing in the spring, you could leave it at more risk of infection. But certainly as you get later into August and the fall, it's going to slow down pretty quickly. Have we ever had success doing this through the micro-injection systems? So this is a great question of, why can't we utilize the micro-injection process? The first is just the sheer volume of material that is being infused. When you're looking at infusing, 25 to 35, 45, 50 gallons of solution, the Q-Connect would just not be an efficient method to do that. And you have to dilute this material quite heavily because of just the nature of the chemistry itself. It has to be diluted. And especially with fungicides, and this goes to speaking to oak wilt or baroque blight, where you need to get complete distribution of the fungicide throughout the canopy. And the more that we dilute this material, the better the distribution laterally and throughout the entire canopy. Contrast that with an insecticide. If we're looking at something like emerald ash borer, where we just have to have the insect at some point feed on and ingest an insecticide, then we can see much better distribution as a micro. But as a fungicide, it does need to be done through a macro system. Mark, I don't believe that this would be acceptable for credit training for your Oregon spray license. Question on Arbitect, has it been found effective with other diseases? It has been found very effective with sycamore anthracnose. at reducing down or reducing the cankering stage. And it's very commonly treated for that. And then most recently, we've also found that it is very effective for not just one season, but also two in reducing beech leaf disease. Another question around rate reductions. So with Dutch elm disease or fungicides in general, we want to be very conservative with how much we reduce the canopy or the rate associated with the canopy, because the potential downside of reducing the fungicide volume and not having enough of it in the plant is worse than if we have a little bit more product in the tree than maybe is absolutely necessary. Because crown reductions are a bit of a it is a bit of an art form in that you're trying to estimate how much of that canopy is still remaining versus what's actually there. So whether you're seeing is that 60% or is that 70% or is that 80 can be difficult to fully judge. So we prefer and coach to be very conservative, especially with fungicides, on how much you reduce the rate down. And if you're ever in a question of what, how much should I reduce this tree down, I recommend reach out to your territory manager, reach out to your arborologist, or give our tech support a call and take a photo, and we'll be happy to coach you through that. And with a reduced rate, you can get full protection so long as the amount that's being reduced and I'll maybe make an example of, so let's say you had a 30-inch elm tree, for example, and you reduced because maybe half of the canopy was missing, and you reduced that rate down 25%. I would assert you would have full protection for that canopy, but if you were to reduce it down 50%, but maybe there's really only 25% of the canopy missing, you could end up underdosing and not having quite enough fungicide within the plant, if that makes sense. So it's better to have more fungicide than too little. Great questions. Let me scan through here to make sure I didn't miss any. Question on watering. Yes, so this is should we water deeply, do a deep water, a deep irrigation the night before? Absolutely. If you can have the homeowner or, do it yourself where you put out a hose, and do a deep soaking the night before, or even if you're able to, maybe the week ahead of time, put out a soaker hose, you're going to see far better uptake and distribution of this product. Michael, yeah, we got your ISA. Yep. Does sycamore anthracnose injections need to occur before the tree is infected? They do not. Most oftentimes, people are treating for sycamore anthracnose after the tree has been infected because they don't notice that it has sycamore anthracnose until afterwards. And what's important to note with sycamore anthracnose is that it's going to only be treating the canker stage. It will not manage the leaf stage. So you're still going to always have those leaf drop with this, but it will reduce the decline of the tree. Is it beneficial to add a water-soluble solution when you water the night before? I don't think it would be, certainly it would be useful, or it's not going to make an impact within this application of increasing it or making it necessarily more effective. I would advocate for doing a fertilization program based on what you see is missing from the soil or the tree itself. It can certainly be useful, but it may not make certainly an impact directly. Any other questions? Looking like we're running out of questions here. I think with that, we can put a wrap on this. I appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you so much. Please do fill out the form. And certainly if you have any questions afterwards, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I'll stick around here if there's any other additional questions too for a minute.